Very much. Shalom, everybody. Hello, hello. We're halfway through the event and the agenda, so I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you so much, Momo, for the partnership and for inviting me here. And it's fantastic to see the enthusiasm and the sheer numbers of people involved in the conference today. So I'll talk for about 10 minutes, and I'll focus on a couple of things. One is trying to give some perspective of what people across the world, the average person, what they understand and expect today around business's role in society. We'll talk a little bit about trust. We'll talk a little bit about purpose. We'll talk a little bit about sustainability strategy. We'll laugh, we'll cry, we'll hug. It'll be quite an adventure. So here we go. The first thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is the reality of the world we live in today. And there's this great terminology that the Pentagon or the CIA, I forget which one, created called VUCA, which is an acronym that stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. So a VUCA world, we know volatility is increasing, both planetarily through climatic effects and climate change, socially through shifting expectations, magnified by technology in many cases. We know that uncertainty has never been higher before. We've got extraordinary amounts of uncertainty. Planning inside organizations, be them companies or governments, is much more difficult than it was even 5 years ago. Complexity, well, we know we're living in an extraordinarily complex time. And ambiguity. The ambiguity of the world today is challenging. Who's responsible for which element? Is it a business's responsibility? Is it government's responsibility? Is it civil society's responsibility? Is it a consumer's responsibility? All of these elements feed into this notion of a VUCA world. So this is the challenge. In this type of environment, what we have sometimes as organizations, one of the most important assets is to have trust. And trust is one of those words that's overused in many ways. And there's many different definitions of trust and values of trust. And I wanted to talk about two different kinds. One, which we can call thin trust, quite transactional, sort of a narrow connection between the consumer, for example, and business. And another one, thick trust, which is broader, deeper, more valuable, but much more difficult to attain. And an example we can think of would be Starbucks, to pick any sort of consumer goods company. When you go to get a coffee or a latte, you would have a certain expectation for that type of coffee, that drink, the price point, the convenience, and that transactional thin trust is what we experience many times a year as consumers. Thick trust goes beyond the bounds of that transactional piece. So how does Starbucks discuss and talk about race and diversity, for example, in their restaurants? How does Starbucks talk or advocate for climate change policies? How does the organization discuss and talk about smallholder farmers? Those discussion points are much broader than the narrow consumer business interaction, and thick trust is what we need to attain, and that's the asset that'll take us through a VUCA world. So let's look at trust across the world. So we do an annual public opinion study, 25 countries, 25,000 interviews. We've been doing it for 19 years, so next year will be our 20th anniversary of exploring the world on issues. As Momo said, we've been doing it in Israel for 3 years now, and I wanted to talk a little bit about trust. So we asked this very simple question around how much do you trust an institution to operate in the best interest of society? That's the thick trust framework in the simplest form for the general public. And here are the net trust ratings. Those who trust this institution minus those who distrust. So across the world, across 25 countries, we have extraordinarily high levels of trust in scientific and academic institutions, relatively strong trust levels in NGOs, business, national companies, much more trusted than global companies, sort of a net of zero in global companies. National governments, low levels, and the press and media also quite distrusted. So we have this interesting structure of those with the most power having the least amount of trust in society. And this upside-down world is a challenge and also a function of that power in many cases. It tells us that for a business, it's very difficult to be trusted on your own. If we're trying to be bold and make these transformative changes that society and the planet requires, we can't do it alone as companies. We need to find ways to collaborate, to work together with more trusted organizations like NGOs, like academic institutions, for example. Let's look a little bit at the Israeli context and Israeli situation. And while the rank order is relatively similar, we see a much more challenging environment in vis-a-vis trust in business with Israeli consumers and citizens. So NGOs and academic institutions, highly trusted relatively, but in Israel we have negative trust deficits across key institutions like government. It's gotten much better in the last couple of years, for example. The media, things have gotten much more challenging from a trust perspective. And then business, while much improved over the last couple of years, remains very difficult. And as all you experience and understand, there's extraordinary pressures and great deal of cynicism towards business and activities. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge for you to be bold. It's a challenge for you to bring people along, to mobilize different behaviors, different lifestyle approaches to be much more sustainable in an inclusive economy without these trusts. So we have an urgency in this country and around the world to try and rebuild trust with citizens. At a sector level, it's also quite diverse. So trust levels in different types of sectors vary across the world. And in Israel, among these 5 sectors, we see the tech sector has relatively strong levels of trust. The pharmaceutical sector has had a very significant shift in the last couple of years to a net trust deficit. And then we have a number of other sectors that are challenged, but especially we see a decline in the banking sector. And the finance and banking institutions are experiencing these all over the world, but especially acute here in Israel to a certain extent. So lots of variability and lots of challenges. It doesn't mean that at a brand level, a certain company would not be trusted, but at a sector level, we've got these big dynamics at play. And there's implications for this. When you have poor levels of trust as a business, we see all kinds of trends and outcomes that are sometimes counterproductive, to say the least, for businesses' success in the long term. On one hand, we have increasing support for regulations to make sure companies are being responsible. And that's an important trend that's happened over the last 10 years across the world. We have campaigns against business that resonate much more strongly in this low trust context that we live in. We have a decreasing sense that companies are paying their fair share of taxes. We have political events that are adding to instability and uncertainty, as we've heard and talked about. We have increasing support and engagement around environmental issues, from water to climate change. And we have a transparency revolution that doesn't always work out rationally as we had expected or thought in many cases. So all of these are implications. What do we do? Well, there's a very simple analysis that we did that gives some insight into a deeper perspective of the way forward on how we rebuild trust with the public and with consumers and with stakeholders. And we asked this question around companies broadly, and we wanted to identify how important these attributes on the right-hand side, how important these are in driving trust. And we added a new one this year called having a corporate purpose, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But when we plot all of these statistically across the world, we see that there's a range of different performance perceptions of business on some issues. And these performances have different impacts on how much they trust companies and business. So in the top left-hand quadrant, we see this focus quadrant. We have low performance relatively. So companies aren't seen as performing well on being open and honest or being environmentally friendly. Yet, these are important drivers for rebuilding trust. So transparency is one of those critical elements, but it's not sufficient. It's a critical part of the engagement process to rebuild trust, but we have a whole bunch of other issues that are also important. In the top right-hand quadrant, we have this idea, this nebulous idea of a company that has a corporate purpose. And we describe that as making a positive difference in society through its products, services, and operations, the simplest way to try and define purpose for consumers. And we see that this is positioned differently than some of the more sustainability or CSR attributes, where there's positive ratings for company performance by consumers, and it's meaningful in driving trust. And this is important because people are already there. People see that companies can be purposeful and brands can be purposeful, if not responsible, if not sustainable. This window into this concept of purpose becomes an important difference, I think, in the CSR conversation. The last 15 or 20 years, we've been trying to talk to consumers very poorly around what sustainability is, what corporate social responsibility is, and we haven't done an effective job. What we stand for is unknown by many consumers across the world. And part of that is the technical challenges related to sustainability and CSR, and we've had a difficult time communicating and engaging consumers. Purpose offers a window that way because it's a very simplified model for business that's much more in line with where consumers understand the role of business. It's not meant to be superficial, it's not meant to dumb things down, but it does allow us to have a more constructive conversation today with consumers before we leap into a sustainable business model. And that's important. Psychologically, we can handle 10% innovation. That's the sweet spot for innovation, 10% difference. When we get beyond that, it's much more difficult for people to pick up things and to integrate them. And purpose is a much closer model for consumers. When we ask people across the world, who's a purposeful brand? What company do you think is making a positive difference in society through their products, services, and operations? At a regional level, we see all kinds of diversity, local champions and diverse champions. Some are from the food sector, some are from the tech sector, some are from the banking sector. There's a great variability and regionality related to it. And in Israel, here are the top 6 open-ended question brands that are mentioned spontaneously as being purposeful. And again, a range of different types of sectors: retail, banking, pharmaceuticals, food, electrical utilities. And this is exciting and important. Some of these brands have some traction as being viewed as purposeful and responsible, which is great. But the real story in our global study in 2016 was that over half of the world is unable or unwilling to mention a company with purpose. So we're early days. We have lots of leadership a vacuum to fill with leadership going forward. And that's our fundamental challenge in many ways. The good news on this is that we have identified a segment of the population, which we call the aspirationals, who are demanding of business in a positive way. They're more likely to trust business, yet they're also more excited and expecting of business to deliver on purpose, on social issues, and on environmental issues. This segment is as engaged as the deep green segment, the advocates around social and environmental issues, yet they are also excited about the marketplace. They like shopping, they like consumption, they like business's role in trying to address issues, which is unique and powerful. And this is a culturally influential segment because they are ones who dictate in many ways what good looks like, what cool looks like, and they want to have those delightful experiences with brands and with companies, and that transmits across all kinds of other work. So all of this brings us to a conclusion of what we need going forward. We need trust, but to enact trust, we need leadership. And the subtle difference in corporate responsibility in the years that we've been looking at requires leadership that's recognized. This is not a call for more marketing or communications. It's a call to try and better express and articulate and demonstrate profound leadership so people inside and outside organizations understand it, are able to join in that cause, and deliver in the long term truly different types of business models and truly different impacts on society, the economy, and the environment. A subtle difference, but a very challenging one to deliver. So how do we do that? How do we simplify strategically to try and help mobilize and engage? And here's this iceberg metaphor, which is very fitting in 2016, around how do we get to a place where people can engage and understand what business could be and which businesses can be leaders. At the very bottom, we need to understand fundamentally what's material. We've heard lots of conversation around materiality, but what are the issues that are existentially vital for that business, both on its long-term success and the impact it has on society and the planet? And that's an easy thing to say, but a very difficult thing to distill. On top of that, what are the expectations people have an understanding of that unique company or sector? That's the foundation we need to get at. But we can't communicate that. We can't engage people on that level of complexity. It's too much. We need to translate that into different sort of programs and have our CSR strategy work that way. We need to have targets and metrics that we can track internally to be strong managers. And we need to then rise above the water to showcase what fundamentally that means for you as a stakeholder inside or outside the organization. We need to frame this in many ways in a very simple format, a big idea, and then have that articulated, ideally with long-term ambitious goals. In 10 years, we are committed to changing this, something concrete, something aspirational, and something that's truly vital. I'll end with just an example of this, of course, is one of the leading recognized companies, Unilever, on the planet. And one of their 3 uber-arching galvanizing goals relates to improving the well-being of 1 billion people. And the power and simplicity of that is that inside the company, if you are leading the soap business and trying to work on hygiene, that has a great impact. That you are likely going to be successful by improving the well-being of 1 billion people. If you're a bond trader in the city of London or in Wall Street, you also suspect that's a lot of soap that would be sold. If you're a mother with 3 children in Kenya who's concerned about hygiene, that's also in your interest and relevance. And if you're a public health official here in Israel, you also see the relevance of that to your work. Trying to think of those disparate audiences and create goals and priorities that meet all of those needs without compromise is the challenge and the issue. Thank you very much for your time.